So last but not least, my partner in crime, Bill Colglazier. Bill, well, before I introduce him, Bill was actually the co-organizer of this session, working from because this is a FIP FPS session. But Bill is the editor-in-chief of the Science and Diplomacy magazine of the AAAS. But to many of us, he's known as the Science and Technology Advisor to the U.S. Secretary of State. And he's had a long career, but in science diplomacy issues, so he's done much more than that. But Bill's going to talk about science, technology, and innovation roadmaps for the Sustainable Development Goals. So Bill, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joe. Is my slide up now?
Yeah, we see it.
You see it? Okay, great. I'm going to talk about science, technology, and innovation roadmaps for the Sustainable Development Goals. But first, I also want to compliment my colleagues. I thought all the talks were terrific. I learned a lot. Also, in listening to all of you, and although I started out life as a physicist, I see now I've moved much more closer to the political side. So in my talk, you're not going to hear so much quantitative data and detailed analysis, but I hope you'll find it useful nevertheless. Well, the quest for developing a roadmap for achieving sustainable development, it's been a long quest. However you define sustainable development, it's been going on for at least 50 years. So I got my PhD in 1971, so it certainly lasted my whole career lifetime anyway. And it's a road which has had many twists and turns along the way, and I'm going to talk about some of them. And now in 2022.
Sorry, Bill. Could yes. You start your presentation? Sorry to interrupt. Put it in presentation mode.
Isn't it in presentation?
No, it's not.
But wait. Let me. Is that right now?
Ah, perfect. Yeah, thanks. Okay. Sorry again.
No, thank you, Joe. Sorry about the glitch. I'm going to talk about science, technology, innovation roadmaps for the Sustainable Development Goals. And this quest for developing a roadmap for achieving sustainable development, however you may define it, has been going on for at least 50 years. I got my PhD in 1971, so it's certainly been through my career lifetime. And it's a road that has gone through many twists and turns. Now in 2022, I would like to pose several questions, which I'm going to try to comment on in my talk. One is how we, and when we talk about our societies, have they accomplished anything significant in this quest? What is the value of the efforts at the subnational, national, and global level? What is the impact of diplomacy, politics, culture, governance, as well as science and technology on this quest? What are the prospects as we look to the future? But I'll take a relatively near-term future for the looking, say, at the taking a pragmatic view of the next 10 years or so. And although I start out only intending to be a theoretical physicist, like many of my generation, I'm sure many of you here in this audience, we've also wanted to use our expertise to try to help the world make a better place. I ended up spending much of my career, when I say this interface of science, society, policy, politics, and diplomacy, and including the topic of sustainable development. So what I'm going to say really is somewhat of a personal roadmap as I try to learn about this topic, what I've learned, and also to tell you a little bit about it. As we though look to the future, I've always been an optimist, particularly about the role of science and technology for helping make progress. But the last 2 years, as all of you know, have been tough. First of all, with the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, I got the message of the cancellation of the March 2020 APS meeting just as I was getting ready to go get on an airplane to go to that meeting. Although I think the APS was very wise in canceling the in-person meeting that March. And then, of course, in the last, since February 24th of this year, we've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, something that many of us thought would never happen, but it has truly upended the world. So I'm going to be talking about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations 2030 Agenda, and Brito sort of provide an overview of them. Might mention that goal number 3 is good health and well-being. That certainly covers the pandemic issue. Goal number 16 is peace, justice, and strong institutions. Very important, the importance of that one.
Bill, can I interrupt you once more?
Yes.
We're still on your opening slide, so we weren't sure if you were advancing or not.
No, that was all intro. I'm advancing now.
Okay.
So when I said it's going to be a personal journey, I just want to show us a couple slides of people who had physics backgrounds in the political world, which also helped me sort of make this transition. One was Congressman George Brown. I was, I guess, in the 4th class to be a AAAS Congressional Science Fellow working for Congress. He got his degree in industrial physics, but he spent a lot of his career actually trying to thinking that science was extremely important for trying to improve world affairs. I wanted to show another physicist, Pete Panofsky, in the background, another mentor, as well as Paul Doty, a world-class biochemist who I work with, who were also mentors that, although they were great scientists, they never served in government, but they had developed a lot of their time in trying to, what I would say, are the larger goals of sustainable development. I could have shown also Sherry Rowland, another mentor, and Millie Dresselhaus, a third. Well, going back to the history of how did we get to this, at least at the global level, the pathway leading to trying to think about sustainable development. A lot of people go back to a report that was done in 1987 for the United Nations. It was chaired by Grove Brundtland. It's often called the Brundtland Report. And its title was Our Common Future, dealing with sustainable development. And this kind of been given the canonical definition of sustainable development has come out of that report: development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sort of seeking to reconcile economic development with protection of social and environmental balance, that highlighted these 3 components: environmental protection, economic growth, and social equity. Then there were multiple United Nations conferences that followed. The notable one in 1992, the Rio Conference, known as the Earth Summit. Although I was a professor of physics at the time, in 1991, I went to work for the U.S. National Academy of Sciences on a sabbatical. First at the international office, and then to the executive officer to help him oversee the studies. And all of the academies do many studies on all kinds of topics dealing with science and technology applied to public policy, both nationally and internationally. We sought to undertake a number of studies with scientific communities in other countries dealing with topics that dealt with what you might call the issues related to sustainable development, including with the Chinese academies over the years on air pollution, with the 10-year project funded by the Gates Foundation, trying to help science academies in Africa become more important advisors for their governments on public health issues. Even working with Iran, encouraged by both governments for 15 years, dealing with topics like sustainable development in cities. In 1999, well, actually in that year, there were 2 reports during my term helping to oversee these studies, which dealt with these issues in a significant way. One was called Our Common Journey. It was actually not funded by the US government. It was funded by a private individual. It turns out the private individual, George Mitchell, is known as the father of fracking. He was an oil and gas man. He immigrated from Greece, created a company, but he always thought sustainable development issues were important. So he provided in funding to the national academies to conduct studies related to sustainability, and this was the lead-off study. Our common journey was kind of a play on words. The Brundtland Report was our common future. This report emphasized that in terms of applying science and technology to the challenges of sustainability, it really is a journey. The journey of learning and doing between policymakers, between the public and civil society and the science technology community, trying to find out what works, what doesn't work, and making corrections as you go along. The second study that came out in 1999 that also influenced my career, also funded by a private individual, not funded by the US government. It's called A Pervasive Role of Science, Technology, and Health in Foreign Policy Imperatives for the Department of State. It made a number of recommendations, and the Secretary of State at the time, Madeleine Albright, did not adopt all the recommendations. She did adopt one significant one, was to create the position of the Science and Technology Advisor at the Secretary of State. And when I retired from the Academy in 2011, I was asked to, it was set up as a 3-year non-political fixed-term position. Although I've been in Washington for many years, I never actually served in the US government, so that was a learning experience in itself. But from 2011 to 2014, I was the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. And I wanted to mention in my 3 years, learning a lot from engaging with, 80 or more countries around the world dealing with science technology. One of the things that struck me the most was the first topic every country wanted to talk about when I engaged, not only with their governments, but also with their scientific community, was how science and technology can do more to stimulate innovation and economic development in this globalized, competitive, interconnected world. I found that almost every country, no matter their level of development, was making ambitious plans to try to compete in the world-class level. They saw that as essential for their prosperity and security. They're willing to modify policies, investments to try to build a more innovative nation. Otherwise, they thought they were going to be left behind. And they wanted to collaborate with the most technologically advanced countries on science and technology innovation. And so it was an asset for diplomacy, in my view, of these countries, and that certainly included the United States. Well, when I was at the State Department, that was during the period when the member states of the United Nations were negotiating over what would become the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN 2030 Agenda. It had been preceded from 2000 to 2015, something called the Millennium Development Goals, which applied only to developing countries, focused on topics like poverty and no hunger, health, et cetera, education, but again, applying only to developing countries. Actually, a fair amount of progress had been made, and there were metrics for each of the Millennium Development Goals, things like reducing poverty. A lot of the progress was made by countries like China through their economic development. Well, the agreement of the member states of the United Nations was, after the Millennium Development Goals ended in 2015, was to have a replacement called the Sustainable Development Goals, and they would apply to all countries, not to just developing countries. And the UN works by a consensus, a negotiation process. And so countries had different ideas over how to approach this. I might mention that the United States wanted to have a few goals, not many goals, but if you have many goals, nothing is a priority. I actually personally thought that was a mistake. It turned out to be that other countries won that argument. And so the 17 goals cover almost everything you can think of. No matter where a country is, they can probably, in their national plans, their national goals, they can find them somewhere embedded within these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And you heard from Brito that this 5 Ps, the first 5 deal with people. Roughly the next 5 deal with prosperity. The 5 after that with the planet. And then number 16, peace, and 17, partnerships. When Brito was actually collecting his data, the one that he didn't collect data on in terms of scientific publications, because it probably would be impossible to do, is on partnerships. But the partnerships is an extremely important component of trying to make progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. But the interesting to me, why I think the 17 SDGs is really a great gift. One, it is actually a political definition of sustainable development. This is what matters to politicians and diplomats. The goal is to accomplish all of the goals, not just some of the goals. And clearly there are synergies as well as there are conflicts between some of the strategies to accomplish goals. So you have to look at ways to maximize the synergy and minimize the conflicts in trade-offs. And for each of the goals, there are a bunch of additional factors. Just to give you an illustration of what's under particular goals, I just took goal number 9 and listed some of the objectives. You can see they go in great detail: enhance scientific research, support domestic technology development, etc. And within each one of these targets, there are indicators. And the next slide just gives you an example of some of the indicators for targets in 2, 2.4, 12.6, and 13.2. Trying to come up with quantitative metrics is a challenge with these very broad areas. Each one is almost an undertaking in itself. So there are many targets. I think there are 169 targets and many, many indicators. And a lot of the indicators are weak, but at least it was an attempt to try to be much more detailed about what is trying to be accomplished in making progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. As part of the effort of the UN 2030 Agenda, the UN Secretary General appointed a 10-person advisory committee of people outside of government of the UN, as you might expect: 5 men, 5 women, 5 from developing countries, 5 from developed, 5 from developing countries. But I was a co-chair of that group, but I learned a lot from every one of them. And the way it was structured within the 2030 agenda was something called, with a strange name, called the UN Technology Facilitation Mechanism. As the negotiations were occurring among countries on the 2030 agenda, the diplomats had recognized that science, technology, and innovation are extremely important, but they didn't know quite how to capitalize on it sufficiently. There have been many negotiations over the years, mainly between developed and developing countries, over patent rights, a lot of disagreement, and not much progress. And so after being appointed, my colleagues and I met with the country representatives who negotiated creating this thing called the Technology Facilitation Mechanism, i.e. how technology can facilitate achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And they said, we don't know quite how to do it, but what we really want through this is a way to actually accelerate the way that the societies can capitalize on what science, technology, innovation can bring. And I'm like Solomon. I think that in many cases, innovations in science and technology can leapfrog over some of the political difficulties. A good example of that was achieving the Montreal Protocol back in the 1980s. But as part of this technology facilitation mechanism, there are several components. One, they have an annual meeting at the United Nations every year. It's a multi-stakeholder forum, so it's not just diplomats, it includes people from civil society, from cities, from the science and technology community, the 10-member group, as I mentioned. There's an interagency task team of UN international agencies that form work groups. There are over 45 agencies represented. Countries are encouraged to provide voluntary national reviews of what they're doing, and those are presented at these STI forums. By the way, the next one will be on May 4 to 6. The Global Sustainable Development Reports every 4 years, looking at this role of science, technology, and innovation. There's one in 2019, there'll be another in 2023. And the TFM reports both to the high-level political forum at the UN as well as to the UN General Assembly. I want to highlight other reports have done as part of this process, which are, I think, also quite illuminating and fun to look at. The International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, with scientists around the world, have a series of reports called The World in 2050. They're all available from the IASA website. And they try to cut the 17 goals into 6 key areas where they think are the ones that we have to emphasize human capacity, demography, consumption, production, decarbonization, et cetera. But it's fun reading some of these additional reports that have been produced through this effort. One that I've been involved in, which the 10-member group that I was on, they emphasize very much there's wonderful rhetoric in the United States, but how do you turn the wonderful inspirational rhetoric into real action plans and roadmaps for concrete achievements? We also emphasize capacity building in science, technology, innovation, and strengthening science advice in countries. Well, in terms of these work groups of the IATT, the one that I've been helping with, is a work group on roadmaps called STI for SDGs roadmaps. And what that idea was, most countries have a national plan of some sort, even if they don't call it that. Many have a plan for trying to increase their capacity in science, technology, innovation. They also, many of them have a plan for achieving the SDGs, and these STI for SDGs roadmaps are kind of the intersection of all three of these plans at the national level. And a number of advanced countries, not including the US, but Japan and the EU countries in Europe, agreed to help developing countries to produce these STI for SDG roadmaps. There were approximately 20 countries interested. 5 pilot countries were chosen in 2019 and expanded to 6. And they're all in the process of developing their STI for SDG roadmaps, where they have buy-in from the top of government down to the people at the working level, building them up as societies. But again, showing the impact of the political world. I list the 6 countries down there. Notice that 2 of them, Ethiopia and Ukraine. Ethiopia, of course, has a civil war that's been occurring, the Tigray region, and then, of course, what happened in the Ukraine. So again, you can see graphically how the war and conflict can disrupt the best laid plans and trying to make progress on sustainable development. One other issue that consumed a lot of time at the discussion among the diplomats at the United Nations, they saw great opportunities in the fact that science, technology, innovation are moving so fast, emerging technologies, and they wanted to certainly have them apply to working towards the Sustainable Development Goals. But they also saw that all of these new technologies created threats and disruptions. They could disrupt societies, they could cause concerns and problems. You could take in every one of these, whether it's cyber technologies, quantum technologies, AI, synthetic biology, and so on. Certainly happened with social media. So a lot of the effort also among the diplomats and among the countries, the political people and governments, was on focusing on the impacts of emerging technologies, both the upside and the downside, and what can be done to maximize the upside and to minimize and deal with the downside. I just might mention the bottom. I'm spend part-time as editor-in-chief of this little journal through the AAAS called Science and Diplomacy. It's all online. It's not an academic journal, but it's really for practitioners who are interested in this interface. And we just have a special issue that's on the website now on dealing with emerging technologies. And this past week had a very interesting webinar that I believe is on the website. So, in sort of coming near to the end, should we be optimistic or pessimistic about what's been happening in the world in terms of trying to move towards sustainable development, achieving it in the year 2030? We see the impact of the pandemic. It's been a setback. I was struck by how poorly the United States did. I thought we were the best prepared country in the world. Other countries had enormous challenges as well. I would like to recommend, there are a bunch on the UN website. I think I have the URL a little later. They do a bunch of policy briefs. There's one that I and others were involved in part, policy brief number 62, called The COVID-19 Pandemic, a wake-up call for better cooperation at the Science Policy Society interface, which really has a number of recommendations of how we might do better the next time around. With the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we can't forget the importance of SDG 16 on peace, justice. As I said, it can destroy sustainable development plans almost instantly, and we need to focus ever more so on what scientists and scientific institutions can do to reduce conflicts and wars. Remembering also there's no SDG on democratic governance. That never have been a consensus agreement among the world's nations, and the tremendous impact that politics have on world affairs and what we can do in terms of making progress on the SDGs. Yet I'm still an optimist. There are many efforts to accelerate progress on the SDGs that are going on around the world. And this focus on strengthening the important role of science and technology continues. I just wanted to mention two very recent efforts because I think they're quite relevant and interesting. Yesterday, in fact, Brookings and the UN Foundation released a report called The State of Sustainable Development Goals in the United States. I mentioned that as part of the technology facilitation mechanism, countries can produce voluntary national reviews of their plans. The US has not done that at all. It's unlikely that it will ever produce a voluntary national review, although I wish it would. But anyway, so this report from Brookings and the UN Foundation is an attempt to have sort of a shadow US voluntary national review. The second one is a study underway with workshops coming up in April and May through the National Academies. It's a committee, a co-chair, focusing on operationalizing sustainable development. Again, it's turning the rhetoric into real actions, and it's looking what's happening at the local level, the national level, as well as the global level. It was stimulated by a conference last year sponsored by the Academy of Sciences and the Nobel Foundation. But there are many other efforts that are currently underway at the local, national, and global level. I think one that's extremely important now that the US is back in the Paris climate agreements, there are very active negotiations going on by national governments to strengthen the commitments that countries are willing to make voluntarily on reducing greenhouse emissions as part of the Paris climate agreement. Lastly, and sort of thinking about what is the legacy of science, technology, innovation to future generations, what we all do, conducting research, finding new innovations that can leapfrog over the political and policy difficulties that diplomats cannot get over on their own. I think the Brundtland report in 1987, the definition of sustainable development would be better with a slight change. Remember, they said it was meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I think what science and technology contributes, it's really meeting the needs of the present while expanding the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And the greatest legacy of those, all of us who are involved in trying to advance science, technology, innovation, besides doing what we can to help avoid wars, terrorism, conflicts, is building knowledge-based societies and accelerating the expansion of scientific knowledge and useful technologies. And lastly, any of you that are interested in these kind of issues, particularly the role of science diplomacy, just mention again, sciencediplomacy.org. I listed. It's also, I get to do editorials periodically. I've listed some of the more recent ones. So I will end it right there, Joe. I hope I've got you close to being on time.
All right. Thank you very much, Bill. Let's give Bill a hand. Great. So it's open for questions. Any questions from the physical audience? While I check the... I don't see there. Oh, sorry, Bill. I'm just, you know, when you get old, you need new apparatus. Okay, so I've got.
I understand, Joe. I've got that problem too.
Yeah. So no, it was a really interesting point. Actually, I was thinking about the rationale for wars. You know, if I thought about the Roman expansion, it seemed economic, right? You get more land, grab more gold. But it seems like I think there's an article in the New York Times recently that just said, back at least 100 years ago, somebody really declared that wars were obsolete now because once you grab more land, you actually take on a burden. You don't take on an advantage. But I think this idea of the the cooperation with science, in terms of economics, it doesn't make sense to wage war, but then we see it. Do you have any idea? Well, at any rate, that was just a comment. Well, actually, do you, yeah, you have a comment.
Let me just give you one response. I hope some of you were able to see, this morning, there was a session on the 100th anniversary of Andrei Sakharov's birth, which was quite inspirational, going through his history, of course, and the Soviet Union at the time, the emphasis on human rights of scientists and the obligations of scientists around the world working together. Those are the kind of things I think we have to make sure you remember and reinforce as we go through difficult periods like we are right now today with the war and Russia and Ukraine. I think, and so I'm very glad the APS has subunits like the Forum on International Physics, the Forum on Physics and Society, the studies that have been done on arms control issues, a recent one just came out from POPA. So I think the American Physical Society is trying to help, and this contribution of scientists trying to instill the values that come out of doing science into the values that all our societies need to embrace.